go. Great reminder, as soon as it starts, to go ahead and put on vibrate. Anyways, everybody, I get this posted over the Discord real quick. Oh, there's my voice. Yep, that's always fun to hear. Just getting everything set up, guys. Give me just a second. Let's see, how's everybody doing today? Just gonna give it a few more minutes, make sure we get everybody in here. Make sure the stream's all coming across clear. Let's see. Just waiting for it to catch up. Alright. Live, looking pretty clear. Alright, so let's start off first with a basic recap of what we did last time. So you guys remember, we came in and we created this domain controller. So this is just the basic features. We left off with creating our first account. Let's go ahead and get into our remote desktop. That way it'll be easier to see. But we created our remote desktop session. Or sorry, we created our domain controllers. Already getting all sidetracked. All right. Yep, just get everything set up. Getting our remote desktop up and going, and it was it you? There we go, full screen again. Okay, so if you guys remember, we actually just set up this domain controller last time. We, just before we left the stream off, had created our first user. Once again, going back to that. Let's see. Users and computers. We created our first user, which is Matze Hackerman. Okay, so looking here, under his account. Under his account, we just set it up as a very basic account. We joined it to the domain all safe, which is what we created. If we go under to his member of, where was that? I just saw it. Member of right here. He's just a domain user. Nothing fancy about him. Nothing's been applied. Nothing makes him, do anything fancy. He's just been added. He has the ability to sign in. So real stupid, simple stuff we've done so far. So one thing real quick is I have forgotten the password that I set for the account. So we're going to go ahead and kind of demo something that's real nice. This is going to be more on the administrative side, but just go over to reset password. Set password to whatever we want it to be. And we're going to unlock the user's account. So typically the reason we have these options combined together is typically whenever you'll get the call for changing a password, it's usually a person who's forgotten their password already. So they've tried it a couple times. They've now locked their account out. So what they'll do is, hey, IT, can you reset my password for me? Can you unlock my account? I can't sign in, this, that, and the third. Let me increase that light brightness real quick. I think that was as bright as it goes. So we're going to go ahead and reset that password to something we know. Go hit OK. And bam. Matze Hackerman's password has been changed. So if you guys remember, there towards the end of the last episode, we tried to sign in with Matze Hackerman. And my running theory was that we couldn't do it because of the lack of permission. So a domain controller really should only be signed into by admins. And so by default, if you're not part of the domain admins group, the domain controller does not let you in. So I was able to test that. We are going to go over a couple things real quick. So first and foremost, we are actually going to minimize that real quick. Go ahead and close out that. Domain controller is still running in the back. But as you see, we actually brought up a new virtual machine here. So this one I've done some testing on. We're going to go ahead and was it snapshot? Restores from a snapshot. So the reason I'm restoring from a snapshot is because part of that testing method to make sure that Matze wasn't a broken account. Hey, what's up? What's up, Jason? Okay, so part of that process of making sure that that account wasn't broken was also just trying to verify what the issue was. The best way I knew how to do that was to give it a neutral environment for it to sign into. So just a normal computer, nothing special about it. Just the ability to sign in and sign in to begin with. If we could get in with a normal account, that kind of proved that the issue was the permissions assigned with the account that we created, more than it was the actual domain controller having issues. Just make sure, see if this is guest OS and keystrokes, control delete. Anything? Anybody home? Looks like we're going to power off real quick. Power back on. Hey, what's up? How you doing? But so once we got the this machine tested up, I put it onto the domain for us to test. Matze was able to sign in, get onto the dashboard. So that's kind of the plan for today, is to kind of teach you the next step, which is going to be to add devices to your domain to actually allow them to utilize what we've set up so far. So every device, so all these rule sets that we set up and everything apply to every device that belongs to the domain. Realistically, you can communicate with the domain as long as you're on the same network with it if the device is not on that network, but it gets a little harder to actually get it to function in every capacity. Like, you can't sign in with the users that we use, but if you need to access things, you can. Okay, so as you can see, this sign in that we have right here is good. This means that this is our pre-domain ad user account that I had set up. So we're going to go ahead and leave it in this view real quick just because I want to show a couple things. How's everybody doing today? I'm curious, for how many of you out there have actually used Windows AD before, have heard of it? How many are, in the industry? And for those who aren't, what kind of brought you here to this stream? Obviously, AD is not a standard thing within the hacker hobbyist area of IT, or I guess of InfoSec. So what got you here today? All right, so we're here on the desktop. We're going to do one of the things most people do when they first get a new environment set up, which is install a browser. So we're going to go and use trusty Edge for the one thing that Edge is useful for, which is to install the next browser. So no, everything's slow. I'm actually, I've been doing some research, putting together a playlist. The plan is to kind of prevent some of the quiet time and the soft areas. We're going to end up doing some DMCA free music. That way we can kind of, float with it a little bit, instead of these awkward tinges waiting for load times and everything. So hopefully pretty soon, by the next stream, we'll have that. But speaking of the next stream, the stream is scheduled for every Friday. Next week I won't be streaming. I'm actually leaving for my honeymoon on Monday. So this will give us time today to start covering some of the basics and give you guys a chance to catch up if you haven't gotten to fully follow on this process. The first episode was obviously how to build the domain controller. The second one's going to be starting to add devices and create users and a couple different things in that region. We're going to start poking around at that. So during this time off. Gives you guys plenty of times. Been building a rat the past few days. Things worked except the keylogger. I've been struggling. Yeah, for those of you who've been in the Discord, you know the struggle that Cosmo's been going through for that rat he's been building lately. Honestly, though, it's a beautiful piece of code. Some of the stuff it does, how elegant it is, the way that it's built out. I'm not going to say too much on it just because it's still kind of a private project that he hasn't decided when to show off yet. But honestly, looking at it, it's kind of scary. For those of you who don't know, the whole point of this series right now is to follow along with the Windows 80, teach you guys who are trying to get into the industry some administrative stuff, teach the guys who are payload developers how to test your payloads in accurate environments, and for the blue team guys like me, we're going to work on some defensive stuff. But you don't really know if it works, like attack-style hacking, unless it's been tested. So, once we start to get to a more secure area and we start kind of running out of little projects to tighten up without adding new, bigger things that are going to be whole individual segments itself, we're actually going to bring Cosmo and a couple of the other guys from the server, and they're going to have access to a machine that's on my network that's hooked up to this domain controller, and they're going to have a free-for-all, trying to see just if what we've done it actually defends against what we're trying to prevent. So, yes, we've had some curious projects going on with the Wi-Fi Pineapple. Actually, speaking of the Wi-Fi Pineapple, I just printed out the tactical case, I think 2 days ago, and it's pretty solid. It's a nice little addition to the Wi-Fi Pineapple. And for those playing with the Wi-Fi Pineapple Mark 7 II, there was just the other day a release of what they're calling the Wi-Fi Pineapple 2.0 for the Mark 7 firmware. It's supposed to be pretty nice, but I haven't gotten the chance to install it just yet. I intend to play with it, but obviously I've not really had much time planning, the stream, getting things ready, testing some of these errors that we kind of ran into last time. But let's get to where we're going. Let's go and grab Firefox. And we're going to download Firefox. The reason we're doing Firefox instead of Chrome, when Chrome was kind of a default amongst many companies, is just because it's a lighter weight. This is a smaller VM. It's really only meant to be... Yes. For those of you who are still caught up on the Wi-Fi Pineapple, obviously going to Cosmodium.com over in the courses section. Cosmo does an amazing run-through class of all the different components that belong within the Wi-Fi Pineapple, both digital and physical, and starts really teaching you starts getting you into the modules and the different components, different attacks you can do. Kind of starts teaching you the platform the way you can start building up on it. Alright, we're just going to run through this installer now. So, interesting thing I want you guys to see. Since we started talking, you guys may not have been seeing what was going down here on screen, but notice that during this process of starting this launcher, we never actually entered in a password. That means installation without a password is not required. For those curious as to why that's important, this build right here, this image that's on here, is strictly what you would buy if you bought your new laptop at Walmart. You go and pick up something new, pop it open, you go to Best Buy, buy your laptop, it's got Windows installed, it's going to take you through the process. Do you want Cortana? If you check yes, you are a monster. But this is what this image is. It's standard, there's nothing special about it. I've just created a user, and that's it. As you guys saw, it allowed me to install Firefox, no questions asked, and that's because the default image for Windows is kind of got a weird thing that I don't like about it, and I feel like it's built insecure. It makes the default user that you create the administrative account. There is still technically an underlying admin account, but you have to use your admin account to set that password for that admin account for it to work, and then you have to sign in to downgrade your permissions. LOL, Cortana. So like I was saying, it makes the default account your administrative account. That means that anything that is ran against it works. Anything you call against it works. There obviously is a couple Microsoft safeties that will prevent you from deleting some of the bigger stuff. Stuff like System, was it System 32? So instead of instead of testing on environments like this, I think it's better to focus on what I'm about to show you now, which is to start migrating to these more realistic environments. Right now, everybody who's building payloads, I don't want to say everybody, that's kind of the bad way to phrase it. A lot of people, when they're testing their payloads, are testing in environments like this. Environments that have no safeties to it. They're, going to work regardless. Once you tell it to do something, it will do it without question because you are the administrative account. But that's completely unrealistic when it comes to the environments in which we're building these payloads for. So when you're going on, stuff like pen tests. I don't want to use pen tests all the time. Security audits may be the best way to do it. Security audits, stuff like that. Whenever you're using these payloads in professional capacities, the odds of you stumbling across an environment that's configured like this, where every user is an admin, I got a story for that here in a couple minutes, it's very unrealistic. It's not going to happen very often. Usually it's only if you can find an administrative account, and typically they like to keep those kind of tucked away. I think that the environment that we're about to set up is going to be one of the best things for testing these payloads because it puts real restrictions as you would find in environments. So real quick, what we're going to do, go ahead and pop open to your Fire browser. Go ahead and click under PC and go to Properties. I don't think they've changed this menu. Let's make sure. Oh, they did change the menu. So as you can see right here, there's a couple things I want to point out. Right now we've still got the default computer name. It's still just desktop, and then it grabbed the serial number for the computer. This is obviously a VM, so here's the quick way. I did it again. For those of you who don't know, I'm used to running Windows at work, so the Windows key for me is Windows exclusive, not to my host service. So pop over here. We're actually going to real quickly search up the group name. Sorry, work group name, and I misspelled that too. Change work group name. So as you pop over here, by default, when you create a Windows computer, it adds itself into a work group. The work group is just simply work group. It puts itself into the work group. And what a work group is when am I going to be on the podcast so I can showcase the work I did? That'll be coming up here shortly. For those of you who don't know, we've been working on some cool stuff over in the server. We recently picked up kind of a newer guy who's been hanging out with us, and he's been working on some cool stuff revolving around Pi-hole, some DNS stuff, dynamic DNS, which will be great for some of these lab connections and everything, and we'll demo some of that. Typically, this course, when I first envisioned it, it was sticking strictly with what was built into Windows Server, but I do feel like there's a couple substitutes that we're going to work on right off the bat, stuff that's free, stuff that's not unrealistic for adding into an environment like this. So we're going to go over some of that stuff, and I'm planning on bringing him in for some of it just because he's done a lot of hard work with it, and we'd kind of like to show that off a little bit. For those of you who don't know, we really like to show off the work that we do over the server for all of our newer people and just the people in general who are there. If you've been working on something cool, if you've been working on these projects, you've been seeing some of the malware that causes us sampling, and you want to get in there, make your own versions, start your own projects, start doing these different infrastructure builds, things that you think would help out in the long run, some of these projects, let us know. Show us what you've been doing, and we'll get you on here. We'll show you we'll fit you to whatever segment you want. Right now, we're actually looking for more bug bounty content as well. That's another big thing. So if you like doing bug bounties and you just want to stream, regardless of whether you find one or not, just kind of showing off, talking through some of the methods you're doing, stuff like that, by all means, we would love to have you here. So, as you can see over here, we were talking about it automatically joins itself to the work group. So what that work group does is, a work group's kind of like a minor domain. It doesn't share any sort of big permissions, but whenever you scan those devices, you can tell that they belong to a specific area. Typically, work groups would be in a situation where you have 3 or 4 devices that really don't need to be hooked up together. They don't need any sort of rule set. They have local accounts, stuff like that. Typically, if you have guest computers, you have temporary people. If you need to monitor their network access and what they're doing, you put them in a work group, and you can assign permissions to that work group temporarily. So, but what we are going to do real quick is go ahead and just give this thing a name that is rememberable. So, we're going to call it 001-W10. I think the name format's simple enough. This is going to be the first computer we're adding to the domain with a 3-digit code, with Windows 10 to mark the OS. And then from there, we're actually going to join it to the domain. But before I do that, there is something you should know. So that domain controller sits on the network. I do cooler malware stuff in the Discord than YouTube. YouTube is mean. So for those of you who don't know, Cosmo is very restricted on some of the work that he can show off. He does a lot of cool stuff with Only Rat and everything here on the channel, but due to terms and service and stuff like that and the way that some of that malware can be interpreted, he can't show off a lot of it. But he is always in the Discord general chat showing off his work as he's going through it. I mean, honestly, we have the inner workings of one of the coolest malwares I've seen in a long time. Cosmo, am I allowed to talk about kind of what's driving that malware? Just to kind of give them a little hint to kind of get them interested? Because it's pretty cool. I don't think most of them would see it coming. Sorry, while we're waiting on Cosmo to respond whether or not I can explain this to you guys. So, when you create a domain controller, by default, your domain controller also installs the DNS services. So, you can run your domain controller as the authentication point of everything. You can put it as your DNS server. You can control everything from one central hub. It means you don't have to worry about configuring all these other different things. We're not going to do that, just because, like I said, later on we're going to expand to some different projects. We're going to end up pushing into a couple of cooler things, specifically revolving around DNS and Pi-hole in particular. For those of you who don't want to wait on that episode, Pi-hole is great over in the Discord server. If you go and talk to Jason, he has just done this big, awesome project that involves taking a Pi-hole server, configuring it with dynamic DNS, and then hooking up his VPN with all his filtering. Specifically, I don't know what it is with him and his hate for porn, but he's got a very strict porn filter on his network. Okay, not yet. Alright, so we won't mention what's going on in the back end, but for those of you who do want to know, you are curious, hop over to the Discord server, take a look at what's going on there, and, let's see. Yeah, so I'll do a brief explanation. So Pi-hole is a DNS server that focuses around filtering, blocking, that sort of stuff. So the idea is you make a request to a specific site. It's going to say, hey, this site is on my blocked DNS list, so I won't complete that request. So that's all it really is. It's just a DNS server built on blocking specific things, but it works great for a standard DNS server as well. Some of the features that you can add into it, such as the upstream DNS for stuff like that dynamic DNS, that stuff right there is like amazing. It's stuff that you probably could do within Windows, but the amount of configuration that would be required, excuse me, is just really not something I really want to mess with. And the other thing you got to worry about too is when it comes to recovery, stuff like this, if everything is on one server, when that one server goes down, everything goes down. But going back to what I was saying here, that server sits on the network. It can also be used as your DNS server, but we don't want to set that as our primary DNS server because of this bigger project. But we still need to give the computer a way to identify where this domain controller is, because we're about to add this to the allsafe.local domain, which is what we set up last time. The issue is if I try to search it out right now, it's not going to know what it's looking for. The domain controller, I could enter a DNS registry on the router, tell it, hey, if you ever get any requests for this, point it here. We're not going to do that. What we're actually going to do real quick is just temporarily set up Gray Hat song. No, Cosmo's not Gray Hat. The research that he's doing is strictly research purposes. This is one of those things I got into a discussion with somebody on another server the other day with, even the mention of malwares or different things, unless it was strictly like, hey, this malware infected something, talking about concepts behind it, talking about different methods like that, they shied away from it. In fact, they were threatening to ban members from their servers for that. And I kind of stopped and started asking some questions, why is it that we are... So why is it that we are shying away from these topics? I feel that by shying away from them, we're basically treating it as if it's some sort of black magic, and when it comes up, none of us are going to know what to do with it. I am in the firm belief that malware should be created for study purposes. I don't think it should be sold. I don't think it should be distributed. I do think it has a place inside of labs, especially if you're working on cooler, more advanced tactics, stuff that's not as common, everybody has a standard keylogger. But if you have a keylogger that's a forward stage deployment method with all these different cool delivery methods, stuff that, not delivery methods, response methods, some sort of command and control that's built in a absolutely crazy bonkers way, that sort of stuff, like, by all means, practice with it. But going back to what we keep getting sidetracked because of the chat and everything, a lot of good stuff being talked about, but what we are going to do is temporarily point our DNS over to where that AD server is, simply because it's going to be easier to do that than it is to fully shift our router, set up all that stuff. We'll take care of that later. That'll be part of the bigger project when we actually do the Pi-hole install and we handle all that. So, come over here. Exactly. I mean, Cosmos says it best. Malware is really, the way that he looks at it is automated hacking. It's kind of discovering the vulnerabilities, automating the process, letting it go. It's just kind of runs autonomously without, hopefully, a click, depending on what type of malware you've built and everything. But 2.168.88, and what was that IP address fully? That was 62. So now that we've changed that DNS temporarily, let's go ahead and hit OK. Alright, so good news is that because we've automatically pointed it to that server right now, I say automatically, because we've pointed it there manually, that server, when it first installed, actually found its default gateway, and the same way any device that joins to a network does, it found its primary DNS as the router itself. So the router has its own cooked in, so even though we didn't point this computer currently at the default gateway being our router, it still is kind of inheriting those DNS properties because it says, okay, I'm going to listen to you. Where am I going for my DNS stuff? It says, okay, I don't have what you need for the DNS, so I'm going to go to the next one over. And it says, okay, here's where we're going to go for this. So it's always inheriting kind of the upstream responses. That will change as we join this to the domain, but now that we've got this DNS set up real quick, we've got a nice computer name that's easy to manage. We have the domain name ready to go, so we're going to go ahead and try to join this to the domain. So just going to ask for domain account privileges real quick. So I want to show you guys something real cool. So we have Matze here, the account we created. Now if you guys remember, Matze is not a administrative account. So if we run this right now, it should not join us to the domain. And as you see, it does not accept us as a domain. It says that the username and password is incorrect. It's kind of a generic error, but realistically what's actually going on in the back end is it's checked the permissions for Matze and said, hey, you don't add up, you're not on that level to be able to make those sorts of demands. So it's not allowing it to continue. Hey, Edge. So what we're going to do is go ahead and relaunch that again. This time we are going to use the administrative account. And I need to make sure that, hold on. Administrative is one of those words that you think it would be easy, but for some reason my mind can never actually like get that spelling correct. Administrator, and then there we go. So using an administrative account, specifically the domain admin, if you guys remember, I did tell you guys that there is actually a separation between one type of admin versus the other. The local admin is your traditional permission to install software, permission to change local DNS stuff. Domain admin is where you start kind of fine-tuning the rules of the domain controller itself, the user accounts, the different GPOs, the crafting of GPOs, that sort of stuff. The permissions we relied on to do this in particular were the domain admin. So typically by now, which I'm going to fix that here in just a second, typically right now I would not actually use this administrative account we've built in. So whenever you add a Windows server into, or convert it into a Active Directory server, you typically start with the local account first because it's a local server. It's not been turned into a domain controller, hasn't been joined to a domain controller. So it uses that local account as its first account to sign in with. So whatever password you set as that local account when you first created it will be the same password that you convert to your domain controller. That means even whenever you're setting this up, even if it's just a temporary throwaway account, still keep that account. Still keep that password, secure. So real quick, we've now added it to the domain. It says, hey, we got to restart to apply this. So we're going to go ahead and restart now, because it's not going to let us do anything fancy until after we have restarted anyways. While we're waiting on this restart, we are going to talk about something. So we've already talked about the domain controller and the way that the accounts work and the fact that it has to always ask permission, always be able to communicate. Obviously, that means... I left a question in my laugh message. Sorry, let me take a look at that. Question. With your AD setup, can you take snapshots of the machines connected? Gains access to the base. When I gain access to a base account, I may do some testing. Not too bad. So yeah, you can snapshot accounts. So that's kind of a good question. What happens when you kind of freeze a computer in that state and then bring it back? That's where it gets cool. So even if I've cached an account, the best way to answer this question is actually to finish the chain I just started. So let's get on to that. So we talked about the way that, last episode, the way that local machines, once they've been joined to a domain, will actually communicate with a domain controller. They'll constantly ask permission for everything they do. Every time they sign in, even if you've signed into that computer before, it'll say, hey, here's the password. Does this person look all right? Domain controller come back and say, yeah, that's the person, let them in. That means that you have to have a connection to the domain controller. That typically means it would only be inside of a local network. If you're outside of the local network, you can't communicate with that domain controller, except for the cases where you're using VPNs, but there's very specific rules that apply to that. So, if I have a computer and I have an account and it's part of the domain, but this is the first time I'm signing into that computer, I can't sign in with that account, because it has to be on the local network for the first time to exchange that communication and say, hey, is this person okay? After that first sign-in that's been into the account, it'll cache that user and its credentials and allow them to sign into the machine for 30 days afterwards. After that 30 days, you do have to register you just have to get back onto the domain controller, and there's a chance that it may lose trust. There's a couple different ways to fix this. The shorter way, which seems kind of the long way around at first, is just to remove it from the domain and then re-add it to the domain. You'll have to remove the computer name in between that removal and re-add, and I'll get to that here in just a second. But real quick, I want to point out something. As you guys saw, when you first brought back up, it brought up the local account. Obviously, that local account still exists. This is what I'm talking about earlier. You can still sign in with that local account, so if the password is crappy, which this one is, there is no password at all. Boom. That right there is an instant vulnerability you've just cooked into your system that no antivirus will scan, that no permissions will stop. Local accounts exist still on the system. That's good and bad. We'll get to why it's a good and a bad thing here in just a little bit, but you can cache those credentials for a short period of time. Those cache credentials will be relied upon for verification for the 30 days until it loses trust with the domain. Going back to what you were talking about, that snapshot, if you take a snapshot of a computer or you turn it off long term, say you are moving departments, you're doing this and the third, and the department is going to be gone for about a month while you're doing some transitioning in their environment. Power off those computers. We'll get to that, the bring your own device stuff. That'll be something we cover a little more as we start getting into really adding in some of the DNS stuff, some of the filtering, some of the scanning, because we're going to start by simply covering just the Windows AD stuff, but we're going to start looking at some free tools to start adding into the network too as alternatives, small enhancements essentially if you'll look at it for the network. But right off the bat, if you're just running an AD controller, I don't recommend it. Just simply because, bringing your own devices, if that's the case, I can bring my laptop, plug it in, start running whatever I want to. I may not be able to authenticate with the domain controller right off the bat, but I can see any traffic flowing through that would be destined towards the domain controller or any devices. But going to Cosmo's question, specifically, if a computer has been snapshotted and you alter the data, what happens when you alter that data and kick it back? The short answer is nothing. Nothing's going to happen. So even though that user has been signed in before, even though those credentials are cached there, when it hits that domain controller again, when it hits that network where it can communicate with it, it's going to check and say, hey, here's this person. They're signing in. Is this okay? If the domain controller responds, they're going to say, yeah, it's okay. By the way, here's their updated list of permissions they have. Even if there is no changes to the permissions, it's still going to say, hey, check these permissions. Just so you know. Here's what it is allowed to do. Here's what it's not allowed to do. And the reason it does that is because it shortens the communications that have to happen between the domain controller. If it knows you're not an admin, it's not going to check every 5 seconds to see you're an admin. So it gets an updated list. You go through and downloads it. So if you look, this is back on that local account. We are on a desktop. We can do whatever we want. We can pop open CMD. We can install malware.exe. We can do whatever we need to do. This is not going to stop us from, doing whatever, even if it's on the domain. So let's go ahead and sign out of this account and pop over to the next thing. Sign out. So the bring your own device policies. Here's what I would say at it. If you separate your access points for bring your own devices, or just your ports in general, something like Cisco ICE or some other Mac-based control protocol, access control, that would be okay for a bring your own device policy, but there has to be very specific rules for stuff like that. You have to make sure the environment's prepped for that. If not, it's almost like having a clean room and just letting, normal day-to-day people walk in, dirty shoes, static still on them. You're basically contaminating the environment. There's a chance that nothing will go wrong, but, every little time they enter that room, there's still more and more kind of shifting, more and more risk that you're facing every time. So what we're going to do is go ahead and pop down here to other users. So, as you can see, we are signing into AllSafe. If you take a look, we're going to go with Matze, which is that account we created earlier. And that's my bad. Did I mess up? Hold on. Make sure the domain controller. Check the domain controller real quick. Make sure I got the username right. Display name. Where's my account? Just Matze. Member of. Okay, we're going to do another password reset because I may have mistyped it, but at the same time, I may have just forgotten it again. Reset password. And password has been changed. Go ahead and minimize that again, and let's check. Come here. Matze. There we go. Just forgot the password. My bad. Let me pull up the YouTube space again so I can actually see you guys if you start talking. I highly recommend it. For those of you who are watching it's great, but honestly the playing with it is probably one of the better ways to learn. It's not sexy. It honestly isn't. It's going to be kind of a boring thing. You're going to spend a lot of time on Microsoft Forms, but let me tell you, for those of you who are serious about taking this to the next step, whether that's just being blue team, whether you just want to get into the IT industry, this is going to be a core part of what you do. Understanding this is going to be a core part of your progression in your career. And for those of you who want to go down the attacker side, this right here is going to be one of those things that you hit in every environment. But this will also, if you don't have the knowledge for it, be the quickest thing that stops you in your tracks. AD applies such a strict policy and strict control over his users that if you don't know how to approach it, you don't know how to query for the data and beat up on it the right way, you're going to completely fail an engagement, regardless of whatever's going on in that site. At that point, you're reliant on stuff like, do they have local web servers running inside? Does their IT ticket software have a vulnerability cooked into it that I can get onto a device and then start poking around that way? Stuff like that. That stuff's cool, but to actually gain further into the network, to find the data that's actually going to be useful, to really abuse it properly, you kind of need a little more understanding of this. And it's, as you start to play with it, kind of a cool thing to see. Like, you're taking something that's stupid simple to install, and by doing a couple modifications here and there, we're going to greatly increase the security right off the bat. And then by fine-tuning a couple of smaller things here, very specific for this instance, very specific for that one, we're going to start to see, a more secure environment, a greater touch on it. And it's going to be frustrating for some of the payload guys, especially because you're going to be used to your payloads just running. But then you're going to start finding that they stop running as frequently. You're going to find out that they don't always work now. But it pushes you further. It makes you take these methods that you have, this concept that you had for your payload, and kind of adapt it around. How do I get it to run now? And it sometimes requires you to go from just using a rubber ducky, just straight off plugging it in, to having to adapt some methods, do some pre-work before it, kind of prep it with an account if you can, stuff like that. And we're gonna play with a couple different things that's going to explore some of these vulnerabilities that are in there by default. At some point, the plan is also to install what's called the vulnerable AD. Say somebody's configured an AD, uploaded it, it's a VM. We're going to go in, download that VM, and we're just going to attack it. I'm going to show you all the default things that they've kind of left. And a lot of it starts off as default configuration. Some of them they configured because, they want it to be vulnerable just to show off the attacks. So it's kind of just to discourage you from doing other things, but to show you the different things that could go wrong if you configure it. The other day it was asked while we were doing the stream, why is it that we left a lot of it to defaults? And I don't think I explained that well enough. And that's because Windows AD makes it easy for you to just click next, 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 enter in a couple usernames, a couple passwords, set up some stuff that's for safekeeping, and you're done. You have an AD server. You can function at that point. You can start adding computers to it. We just added a computer. We just created an account. We can start creating roles right now. But by default, it is not the most reliable, secure environment. We can definitely improve that. And so that's kind of the point of leaving it to default, is I want to show you what the risk of that is. We're going to play with it, test a couple things. Not this coming Friday, because like I said, I'll be out, but the Friday afterwards, we're probably going to start actually introducing one of the first attacks, starting to explain some cooler things, particularly with NTLM. So we'll start getting on to more of the attack side. I'll probably bring in somebody for that too. I might have Cosmo jump in just to kind of get some of the attacker views on that commentative side, if that lines up with scheduling. I know actually he's about to be on a very tight schedule. So we'll figure out what we can do with that. But hey, how you doing, Musty? But we are on desktop. So here's something I want to test right off the bat. By default, start without data. We are now going to install Chrome. I know we have Firefox installed. We can uninstall it and reinstall it, but it's going to take a little longer. So let's just go with Chrome. What's up? Okay. Take this Chrome installer, download it. What we're about to test right now is to see, will it still allow us to run without credentials, or will it request an admin? Mind you, one of the big things we're here to test is specifically how much room do we have to wiggle with within the default configurations of an AD. Payloads all the time, even if it's simple to defend. Exactly. And here we go. So let's check with Matze's account and see if this will let it run. So you guys can see there's already a big difference with it. It's already telling you, hey, we need some sort of authentication to make sure this will run. So let's see if Matze has the permissions to do this. Alrighty, right off the bat, huge improvement. As you see, it just shut us down right here. Won't allow us to install it. It's because Matze doesn't have the permissions to run this sort of stuff. It's great. So real quick, let's go ahead and hit nope. What we're going to do, yep, cannot be installed without administrative privileges. We're going to hit no on the continue. So we've already got the installer. Let's go ahead and pop back over to our domain controller. It's got Matze HackerMan here. We're going to temporarily say Matze is a member of this admin group. Let's see what comes up for admin just by default. So we're going to check names, administrator. Just normal administrator. Let's see, was there a domain administrator? We have domain admin, domain computer, domain controllers, domain guests, domain users. Okay, let's go ahead and give him domain admin. Let's see if domain admin alone is enough to give him permissions to install this. So if you guys remember, like I said, on sign in, it'll simply hand over its current permission setup. Let's see. I'm going to research this. Edge. Yes, I agree. Edge. So we're going to go ahead and pop into CMD. If you guys remember what I was talking about earlier, whenever you do that first sign in, when it says, hey, these permissions good, Windows will say yeah and kind of send over a small little bit of information about here's what it's allowed to do. It really hands over its domain groups, and every time it runs anything, it'll query those domain groups to figure out what permissions that group specifically has. So what we're going to do real quick, just to force this update a little faster, is group policy update. I can't spell today. Group policy update. There we go. So as you see, it's updating the group policy. So group policy update by itself is good. It'll update the policy, start pulling it when the computer gets the chance. It'll modify those. But what we're going to do is actually modify the command once it gets done. We're actually going to do a /force. Now what that's going to do is say, hey, give me the new configuration, and immediately apply it. No questions asked, just do it. Take these permissions, run with them, use them. So mind you, this was just domain admin. If you guys remember, there's a difference between domain admin and local admin. We're going to figure out just how much privileges a domain admin has, whether they can still enact as a local admin or not. So you come here, go to our downloads, here's our Chrome setup. Let's run it. Matze. You see, we don't have permissions, which is great. So there's a reason I want to show you guys this. It's specifically to point out what I was talking about earlier with the difference between a domain admin and a local admin. Domain admins are still powerful accounts, still really, really crucial. And depending on what set of credentials you get will depend on how you want to take your attack avenue. If you get a domain admin, you're better off trying to attack the domain controller directly. No, I don't want to. But if you get a local admin, you would want to start attacking on that machine locally, start trying to install your programs, trying to get a foothold in. That would be the type of computer that you want to create some sort of persistence to, some way to connect into, and that would be your pivot computer. From that point, you would start driving your attacks kind of outwards, and you would use that as your base station for trying to gain that foothold to either, laterally move or to attack that domain controller with those escalated privileges. To let you guys know too, Windows computers are kind of a cool in the methods they can move laterally. So certain permissions are configured remote desktop by default. I need to check and figure out if that is specifically for every user. We'll check here in just a couple minutes. But once you have a set of credentials, because you're on the domain, they apply to every computer that's a part of that domain. And because you can query the domain controller and see every computer that's listed in that domain, you have now a list of targets. Not only that, because you have a user account, if your domain controller is not set up correctly, it'll actually respond regardless of permissions to different queries. So you can ask it, who's all in the administrative group, in the local admin group, who's all in the AD group, or I say AD group, who's all in the domain admin group, and it'll just give you this list of targets, just spilling them out. So we'll cover some of that here just a bit, but what I want to show is this. We're going to go in, member of, admin. So right here it just says administrator. It's actually your local admin. With an environment like this for testing malware, I can make some great stuff, and for the payload work, be much more effective in the real world scenario. Exactly. So testing an environment like this that has the real permissions that you would actually see in a real setup, that's great. A lot of the people who test their payloads on computers like we showed earlier, those local machines, just buy it from Best Buy, just buy it from Walmart, pop it open, you run the defaults, everything is going to run. The type of payloads you're building for that only work in conditions similar to that. You're trying to, mess with your buddy, you want to install some sort of prank script, guess what? Program as loosey-goosey as you want, just get the script to run. Their account is most likely an administrative account, so run it. Not a big deal. But when you get into environments like this is where it starts to get to a different level. As you've seen just here alone, trying to run and install that exe did not work. And in just a minute, we're actually going to track down a couple of different files and see what we can run. Try a couple different PowerShell scripts, see if we can run PowerScript, see if we can run MSIs. We already tested exes. Just test a couple different things to see if there's any sort of exclusions too. Yep. We'll get to some of that here in just a little while. Probably not today, but that'll definitely be down the road. But stuff like that, we're going to test to see what all has the permission to bypass without administrative, just to see what it is. But just from what you've seen right there, exe is one of the most common Windows installation files. Malware can be transferred to that exe really, really easily. As we've seen, just by adding this computer to a domain controller, we've already kind of stepped at that level of security. Now, let me finish what I was doing right here. As I was saying a second ago, administrator right here. Administrator is your local admin. I typically like to go in later, rename that group to local admin just to kind of separate it from your domain admins and all that sort of stuff. It kind of gives you a little bit more understanding of separation. And also, changing your default group names is not a bad idea, especially since what we were talking about earlier is the querying of different groups to figure out what they do. You know, if everybody's querying for domain admins and domain admins don't return, it's going to confuse the hell out of them because, you know, suddenly one of their prime targets has just disappeared, nowhere to be seen. So now they've got to... It makes it harder for them to automate tasks like that whenever you kind of change it from the default. But we're going to go ahead and leave it as it is right now. Did I apply that? Let's make sure. Yep, we're good. And go back, do another group policy update force. Alright, that's been complete. So let's try one more time. I think I may have got that password right. Hold on. This operation required. That didn't work. Let's try another group policy, make sure it didn't stick. Or make sure it did stick. No. Maybe it just found something new. Keep in mind, I haven't actually built a domain controller from scratch in 3 years except for test cases for testing little things like this, and I typically don't get as far as creating specific groups like that. I usually create small tasks within the domain controller and assign them to a computer. So some of this stuff, when you get to certain environments, especially if they're existing environments, you usually pick up from where somebody left off, building the groups, maintaining users, stuff like that. You can update on it. I mentioned earlier that you hardly come across environments where everybody's an admin. But before we start troubleshooting this ticket, this issue, I'm going to go ahead and start telling you a little story real quick. So, I currently work at a hospital as the director of IT. When I got into this new environment, got told, hey, this is going to be your role, this is your responsibility, it's this and the third. So immediately I dive into the thing that I know the best, and that I know is kind of the key of it, which is the AD. Start playing around with it. Takes me a couple weeks to kind of get a feel for everything, figure out how it works, figure out some of the external stuff, because I got a couple other things that we'll touch in later. Maybe. Some stuff like laps and hooking up VPN, stuff like with Duo for 2FA. But one day I go to fix a computer, and this computer is a computer in a very heavy use area. There's an issue with a program that needs to be uninstalled, reinstalled. I can't remember what it was at the time, but I go to uninstall it, and I'm used to being prompted for credentials, and it did not prompt me for credentials, which to me was weird. So I thought maybe something's changed in Windows. Got to do some research on that to figure out maybe you don't require authentication to uninstall programs anymore. So I download the installer for this program, and I go to run it, and it runs without needing administrative permissions. So I start poking around at it and start trying to figure out, how much of this is allowing me to do what I need to do. How much can this account do? So I start poking around at a couple things and come to the conclusion that this user is a local admin. So I go to my AD and I start poking around. I find this user account. I'm looking at it and there's nothing that says that it should be a local admin. So I'm freaking out at this point, thinking, well, why is this user a local admin? So I bring it up with my current director at the time. She's no longer there. She was the CFO, and I basically say, hey, here's the situation I've stumbled across. I don't know if you're aware or have this configured, but for some reason this user is configured in this way. I don't know how these permissions are being applied to him yet. I'm still researching it, but this is a security risk. We kind of start talking about it some more, and she brings up the question, well, who all can do this? And so I jump on a computer of somebody else on a different account who should not have these permissions as well, and I do the same thing. I start installing stuff, I start uninstalling stuff, I kind of poke around a little bit just to see where my permissions are. And sure enough, this user was also an admin, and we quickly came to the conclusion that every user that was on this domain was a local admin. But there wasn't a GPO being applied to the users. It was actually a GPO applied to the computers once they entered the domain. This GPO was grabbing every user that was signed onto it and cloning their account as a local account too, and giving that local account as an administrator. So anytime they'd run a task, it would essentially symlink, I guess is the best way to explain it, run with this local account's administrative privileges and just take off. Which is a huge disaster. That means that anything that's plugged into that, anything that's installed, anything that's ran, just goes. Doing some research into this, it turns out that there was a software that's crucial to the hospital's functioning. It required an administrator to update it. Now, the people who built this software were pretty smart. Yeah. So, I'm about to get to why it is, and it kind of irritated me later. These guys were smart enough to understand that there had to be a particular user involved into that to make administrator, or to make that update work. Because somebody has to have that administrative privileges. And if you guys remember, I brought up the service accounts last week too, and we got into a little bit of that. This is a good example of a service account. So, this one had a account that we had to create in the domain controller, give it the permissions, do all this fun stuff, and the script automatically tried to sign in with this user account. The problem is the last guy who was here before me did not know that user account existed. The team who installed the software kind of set it up, just said here's the prerequisites, but did not explain to him how it worked. They had a diagnosis tool. I ran the diagnosis tool, and it was looking for a particular user. Could not find that user with the permissions, so once we gave that user that permissions, we were able to make that software run without making everybody admins. But in between that process of giving that service user or that service account the permissions and removing it from everybody else, there was a small lapse in permissions where it was trying to push an update that was crucial for that next morning that needed to go out. But because the accounts they were trying to communicate with didn't have the permissions anymore, and the new one hadn't fully accepted its permissions yet because of issues that happens when you have two domain controllers if you're not careful. We'll go over some of that later. For those who don't know, you can actually have multiple domain controllers synced up into the same forest or different forest where they'll actually hand off communications. It's a high availability situation. Say domain controller 1 goes down, you're not completely lost. Domain controller 2 can pick it up. The issue is that every computer takes turns with what domain controller they communicate with. So it may spend about 5 minutes on domain controller 1, and then it'll spend domain controller 2. But it's still going back and forth, even if domain controller 1's not there. It'll still try to send its requests there. Long story short, domain controller 2 was not responsive at that time, and that was how we found out the last guy kind of ignored the situation. He was on his last 2 weeks, he didn't care. So I kind of inherited a bunch of problems, including one of the biggest security issues I have seen to date, which is everybody in this place is a local admin. That one was, it kind of shocked me a little bit, just seeing that level of stupidity, I guess is the best way to put it. But as you see, by default, you aren't an admin. Once you join it to the domain, that means a situation like that was very specific. It was very intentional. And you can tell it's intentional because it took work to get it there. Yeah, you guys have no idea earning that check. My first week into that server room that I was at, there was a leak from the industrial air conditioning units. So it's wall industrial units, and the servers are probably about 2 foot from that wall. But all the power cables are against that wall. So it starts leaking because it wasn't draining to the compressor up on the roof to dissipate that water that it was collecting from the room. And so it starts slowly flowing down. I had towels taped above my electrical outlets trying to guide that water there. And every couple minutes, I would have to sit there and remove those towels real quick, put a new one up, try to tape it down real quick, and it took forever. The issue was we couldn't turn off the air conditioning units because obviously we still need to maintain the temperature in the server room, otherwise they overheat. Because if you leave that alone, you leave that server room with how much was running in there, and still is to this day, it'll quickly hit about 90, 100 degrees in that room if you're not careful. Well, probably a little exaggerating. It feels like 90 to 100. But it'll cook those servers pretty quick. There's roughly 30 to 40 servers that sit in that server room. So, medical servers, for those of you who don't know, they take up a lot of power. We started switching a lot of that to virtualization. For those of you who are already in the environment and you're looking for stuff to switch over for virtualization, I highly recommend ESXi. ESXi has been an amazing platform. It also has a nice little feature with, what's it called? vSphere. So say you build multiple instances of EXSI out, you need to be able to control them all from one interface. Excuse me. vSphere links all these different EXSI instances up into one interface for you to go in and control all of your servers. It's beautiful. It's great. So, yeah. Starting off this hospital, it's been a nightmare. We're finally in a good place. We finally have been able to step into it. That's one of the things why I've been kind of hesitant about showing stuff like this, because I'm very public about what my company is. If you know who I am, which I'm not going to start advertising who I am right now, but if you know who I am, you know that I don't hide my real name. And I also don't hide where I work, just because there's no need for it. I mean, I'm not some secret clandestine hacker. I'm a security researcher who's trying to build trust with you guys and show you guys some of the stuff I learned. It took me a while to be able to get to this place, for one, to make sure I had the confidence in the stuff I want to teach you guys, but also some of the stuff that I intended to teach you guys were fixes that I learned through fixing there at the hospital, and I didn't want to give you a half-assed fix and fix a little bit of it but still leave it technically vulnerable. And then you guys be able to track down and say, oh, if he knows this, that means that maybe in his environment, this, that, and the third, and start targeting my hospital. So we finally got to a place where I feel secure enough with the way the hospital's running and some of the new security stuff. If you ask Cosmo, I've kind of went above and beyond. They've given me some deep pockets for this system, and we just got another grant for, millions. So we are tail by It was definitely a trial by fire. The best part about the whole situation, documentation. There was none. There was nothing. He gave me a Excel document with a combination of usernames and passwords, but did not tell me where they went. Or at least like a third of them had labeling, but the rest of them were kind of just like, hey, good luck, figure it out. There was no IP addresses for services, any servers. And at the time, we were paying an MSP close to, I'd say, almost $1 million a month. It was pretty pricey. We were paying them a good amount of money to do a lot of different things. The last guy, whenever they hired this company, they hired him because he was starting to fall behind on some projects. And he was not too happy with the fact that they were being brought in, so he actually cut off a lot of their access, told them what they were and weren't allowed to touch. And so they had zero documentation themselves, but they also they got used to basically being told, hey, you guys are just getting paid to sit here and be here for emergency situations. They were fine with that, because that meant their work was easy. They're collecting a paycheck the same amount as if they were doing huge IT work for people and didn't have to really do anything at all, except for, like, if a server went down, provide emergency support for that. And that ended up causing a lot of huge issues. They let a lot of the stuff slide. Their patch management ended up failing. Their NOC, which we used to pay a lot of money for management and everything, failed very badly. And the hospital relied on that sort of stuff. I had a lot of trust in that software, believing that they did what they were doing what they told us they were, because they're a very wreckable brand in this area. But they failed us. I'm not going to mention names of that company just because it's not nice to kind of go out there and start slandering. Regardless of what happened, it may have just been one really, really crappy situation. Drop the ball on this one, but I'm not going to sit here and drag them through the mud for that. But I say this because you're right, it was trial by fire. You get to the position, there's no documentation, no nothing. They didn't even have a network map. They couldn't tell me, any sort of passwords, usernames for switches, anything I could check configurations on. It was bad. Yeah. So, that 3-day outage that I mentioned, not only did the NOC fail to detect a huge outage, it was a RAID 3... It was a RAID 5 array. 3 drives went out in this RAID 5 array. For those of you who don't know, a RAID 5 array can suffer 2 drive failures, and if it loses a third, the moment that server stops, has to reboot or anything like that, that server doesn't come back to life. Enough data has been corrupted that it essentially can't rebuild itself. It's missing a huge chunk of its brain. There was over a 1.5 year period in which the first drive started failing, and in that time period, 2 other drives had fallen consecutively, and on a Friday night, on a Thursday night going into Friday, our servers rebooted for an update, and that server did not come up. And that server was a VM server in particular, so it wasn't just one server. It was about 8 servers in total that did not come back up. Since then, we have moved over to a new platform. We've got backups that actually work, because during that recovery process, our backups corrupted. Spontaneously, a couple weeks back, they had been corrupted. So, it's, yeah, it's been a rough situation. And mind you, I'm the only on-site tech. I'm the director of IT and sole IT guy right now. I get some summer help every now and then. But we're looking to hire a new employee. But AD, the reason I'm showing this to you guys, has been what's saved a lot of the situation. It allowed me to automate these different processes, make sure everything's cooked up. Software installs. You can automate software installs across every computer on the domain if it's the right file format, the MSI. If you we'll test that out a little bit later, but AD has so much room into things, and it's such a crucial thing. Yeah, I'm the only tech at this hospital. That's the fun part. I'm the only tech for everything that goes on, which means I'm on call 24/7, which technically means if my phone goes off right now, I'm actually gonna end the stream early and, go have a nice little visit with the hospital and take care of some stuff. But yeah, that's one of the main reasons I want to. Matze the goat. No, I'm not telling this for you guys. I'm not saying this to you guys to brag on this situation. I'm telling you this because I want you guys to understand how reliant I am on the system and how reliant a lot of people are. If you're on that blue team side, this right here is going to be one of those great tools for you. It's going to help you manage that stuff. It's going to help you start tightening up those security nets and pulling in your permissions. For the attackers, it's just as important for you to know this. I rely on this. This is the heart of my company. That means this needs to be secure as possible. But it also means when you're on those engagements, this is going to be a huge part of what goes on. This is going to be your core. This is going to be the thing you want to focus on. Because this is the type of thing that draws attention. That's the big money type ticket items. When you find big vulnerabilities in misconfigurations within an AD, that's the type of thing that gets everybody to stop, listen, start opening up wallets, and start writing checks. So. So, let's get back on topic real quick, kind of do a little review of what we've done so far. Just check, see how long we've been streaming real fast. We'll go for a little bit over an hour. Okay, so let's go ahead and recap on some of the stuff we've done just before we kill time. We're going to start hitting that point in which people are going to start tiring out over, length of period and everything. Hey, Kels, what's up? So, what we did was went ahead and installed your first computer on your domain controller. We showed you how to... So we went ahead and showed how to do accounts and the different permissions, how to install those, being over on... Oh, wrong tab. It is this one? Yes, it is. How to apply different security permissions and how those affect the different types of admins. We've seen a little bit of that. And we've already seen just some of the basic security upgrades that happens when you join something to a domain like this. As you have seen, it gives you a huge advantage, something that you could do in your local machines, you could do individually, but this pushes it en masse. You get to control these settings individually, or not individually, as a group. When you start looking at environments that have, 200 computers, is a big environment for one person. Now you start getting into, the thousands, start getting 2,000 computers, 4,000, 8,000, 10,000 computers, big environments like that. Realistically, even with a large team, touching every device is not going to be realistic. So that's where AD comes in. It's a great tool, but here's the other thing too, for the attacker side. You're applying permissions to everybody. There is no individual focus on it, which means there's room to be sloppy. You load it down with tickets, need to apply something real quick, just need to take care of it. Bam, bam, thank you, ma'am. It's installed. It's on every computer. now you end up with some overlap in security permissions. That's where issues like what I talked about earlier, everybody being a local admin, comes into play. Things like this are where you want to focus how these permissions, and that's where we're going to share a lot in and focus on. We're going to end up introducing a tool called Bloodhound. It's one that I actually use not for the red teaming side, but more for the blue teaming side. It queries the domain controller and starts to evaluate the relationships between different domain control or different roles and how you can apply them. And it has this nice little feature where if you want to test and make sure your permissions are clear, you can start with the user and you can say, hey, this is my end goal for permissions. What's the quickest route for me to escalate my privileges there? And it'll show you, starting from here, 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 to here, you can get to this AD group, and it'll give you the commands you need to run. So it's a nice little tool for the red teamers, but it gives you a way as a blue teamer to look and say, okay, here's some weak links I have. Like, yeah, I've just given this person access to the HR printer, but I've also included that as part of another group, and because it's part of another group, it can inherit those permissions, and then because those permissions are involved in something else, it can inherit those permissions. That's essentially how those parent-child relationships with permissions work, and we're going to start working on some proper hygiene when it comes to those roles configurations and how to make sure that we're not unintentionally letting people inherit permissions they shouldn't inherit with these different groups and everything. But really, without getting into anything too deep, I think that's as far as we're going to take it right now. Just, like I said, some of the key things to remember whenever you're setting up your labs, just in case you forget. When you go to join that computer to the domain, you do have to temporarily point it, your DNS, over to that domain controller. Otherwise, it will not be able to find that domain controller. Your low-level privileged accounts cannot sign into your domain controller. By default, you cannot... You got this, girl boss. Thanks, Kels. But what were we gonna? Oh yeah, the inherent permissions that come from it by default. To be honest, if I have 10 minutes and that's all I've got to set up a network and I need to make sure people are secure, I'm not going to go and install antivirus on everybody's computer. I'm actually going to start with this. Antivirus is good, but in my opinion, this is not your go-to method. In my opinion, if I'm taking the permissions of an AD server versus antivirus, I'm going to take AD just about every day. We're going to play with some stuff. We may eventually install a free antivirus just for you guys to test on, specifically for the payload type people, so you can start seeing kind of different detection methods within that sort of stuff. But mostly what we're going to roll around here is just the inherent permissions that are within AD. And the main purpose for that is, yes, we could easily install antivirus. It could take 5 seconds. We can automate it to install on every computer the moment it gets on there. But I want to show you guys the power that's behind AD in particular and where to abuse it on that front. All of you guys are doing your own research into AD bypass and all this other stuff. Or AV bypass, sorry. But AD bypassing, getting through those rules, running queries and sort of stuff like that and trying to escalate those privileges, it's a whole another beast. So, why recreate the wheel with AV bypassing when I can teach you guys the permission structures of AD and you guys can progress it that way, combine all these different, sources into one big, really lethal attack if you're not careful. This is some really dangerous stuff, and it's a very common attack vector just because of where it's at. But I think I've rambled off enough. It's been nice seeing all of you guys, and I appreciate it. But like I said, little reminder, I won't be here next Friday, but I will be returning back the Friday after that. Me and the missus are going out for a honeymoon. Finally celebrate tying the knot and everything, and kind of relax a little bit. I mean, I just told you guys some of the horror stories from my job. I definitely need that week off. So, Fong, everybody. Fong. Sorry, Frong, everybody. But we'll definitely pick up on some stuff. I've got some cool stuff moving forward. I know these last 2 streams have kind of just been dry, bland, trying to set up stuff. We're going to get into the fun attack method stuff here shortly. So stick around. I look forward to seeing you all. Enjoy the honeymoon. Thank you. I look forward to seeing you all guys back here again. And, hey, I'm over in the Discord. Shoot me some messages if you need help setting up your environments. By all means, I'm more than fine sitting into a call and start helping you configure this sort of stuff, answering any questions, and, seeing what you guys can build off this. But, I guess the only thing I have left to say is, the Saints have never looked so weak. But, hey, you guys enjoy.